Grace Robertson Macdonald was a 14-year-old girl who was posthumously nicknamed the Longreach Cinderella. Grace was the daughter of Angus Ranald Macdonald and his first wife, Sarah Grace Macaulay. Angus had been born in Timaru, New Zealand on the 9th of January 1857. He was a grazier, a long-time resident of the Longreach district, and related to some of the most respected citizens in the state of Queensland. For many years he owned Fermoy Station before selling that and moving to Urida Station, 12 miles from Longreach, across the Thompson River from Bimbar, a property of 4,500 acres. Her parents married in 1887, with Grace born at Malvern, Victoria in 1889. Tragedy struck when Sarah died, aged only 30, on the 9th of January 1892. Grace was sent to live with relatives of her mother in Melbourne, paid for by Macdonald, until she was about 8 years of age. She would sometimes live with her father when he visited her in Melbourne, and he seemed to be fond of her. She was then sent to a boarding school for a time. Her father married for a second time to Alma Florence Annie Cowell on the 29th of April 1899. Florence, as she was called, was a trained nurse with 3 years hospital experience. 2 children were born soon afterwards, Ruth Elspeth Mary on the 25th of October 1900 and Alan Ronald on the 21st of December 1901. Grace was taken out of the school and brought to Brisbane and placed in the care of Mrs. Collins, the mother of Florence Macdonald. Ruth became ill around Christmas 1902 from the effects of teething and the heat, as well as diarrhoea, and Dr. Hewer suggested taking the child to Brisbane, away from the hot interior of the state. Florence decided that when she returned to Urida Station, she would bring her stepdaughter with her. Grace arrived at Longreach on the 7th of March 1903. Grace was a robust girl in good health and strong as a bullock. It was said she could lift and carry a bag of sugar weighing 70 pounds and a bag of maize in the other hand. Before Grace came to Urida, a girl had been hired to help with running the household. The girl was let go and Grace took over her duties of housework, attending to the 2 little children, and caring for and milking a herd of goats. It was a lonely life Grace had been brought into. Nobody visited the station except on business, and few people saw her. One exception was the mailman, Walter Poole, who called occasionally. The one time he spoke to Grace, she seemed pleasant and well-mannered. Samuel Irwin worked for 1 week on Urida Station and said that while he was there, Grace was smart, active, intelligent, and did her work well. The first real intimation that something was wrong was noted by another grazier, William Avery, when speaking with Angus Macdonald on the 3rd of October. Grace was a thief and a liar, her father ruefully asserted. She was also very cruel to animals, he added. He had tried to persuade her through reasoning to behave, but it had not worked. So he then tried to change her ways by locking her up for 3 days with nothing to eat and drink but bread and water. Ultimately, he had to beat her. Yet nothing worked. He was now looking to have her admitted to a reformatory school. What do you think of a child you could knock down like a beast, and in a few minutes that she would get up and repeat the offence? He asked offhandedly. Macdonald said his daughter was also suffering from syphilis, which she inherited from her maternal grandfather. Macdonald then made some statement about Grace, which caused Avery to reprimand him for saying so. Whatever was said weighed so heavily on Avery's mind that he felt he must mention it to the police. Not long after, tragedy occurred at Urida. Grace Macdonald died at the age of 14. Her father went to Longreach and sought a burial order from Dr. Alfred Hewer. The doctor instead sent Macdonald to see the police, and Constable Tracy went back to the station to investigate. He told Tracy that Grace had died at sunset, after a short illness. Although they arrived at 3 a.m, the policeman waited until 5 a.m. so he could examine the body in the daylight. The constable's report was sent back, and it was organised that a post-mortem examination would be made in the police presence. The results of the examination revealed that a callous and brutal crime had been committed. Grace Robertson, had been tortured to death. She was in an extremely emaciated condition, with sores all over her body, many of them infected and leaking pus, including a large sore on her stomach. There were several sores on her shoulders, as well as scars which had healed. Her right wrist had been dislocated, the end of the ulnar bone projecting an inch out of the skin, the rest decayed with necrosis and the tissue destroyed, rendering that hand immobile. Grace herself had tied a light bandage over her wrist. An infected wound was also found behind her right elbow. Her left hand had a suppurating sore that went fully down to the metacarpal bone, which was necrosed. Another weeping sore was in the middle of her upper left arm. Yet another large sore exposed her left kneecap, which was devoid of skin. The soles of her feet were covered in sores, one of which was 3 inches long and an inch deep. The doctors extracted dirt and gravel from the sore, which showed she had been walking about without bandages or shoes. Her floating ribs, the 11th and 12th on the right side, were both fractured, one in 2 places. This damage could only have been inflicted by a sharp blow by something hard, or a kick from a man's boot, as these ribs are incredibly difficult to fracture. The body was lanced at this site, and pus issued forth. It was adduced that the ribs had been broken for 3 weeks, about the same amount of time it was speculated that Grace would have found moving about all but impossible. Her stomach held only a little curdled milk, and the intestines were empty. There was no sign of any hereditary disease being present. The organs were normal, and death was ascribed to exhaustion. When questioned why he had never sought medical attention or taken his daughter to the hospital, Macdonald replied he didn't know anything was wrong, and claimed that Grace had never complained about anything. Asked to clarify his statement that Grace was a thief and a liar, he replied that she ate the food and drank the milk meant for the dogs, and then she denied it. He noticed that she also took a can of sausages from the store and remnants of puddings from the dinner table. His explanation for her broken ribs were that the goats had knocked her down and trampled her. There was no sign that any medical care had been afforded to Grace, other than that she vainly tried to apply to herself. Boracic acid had been sprinkled on some of the wounds, as pointed out by Florence to the doctor, but he assessed it could only have been applied very near to the time of death. Florence also tried to blame Grace's emaciation on a bout of diarrhoea, which the doctor failed to find any evidence of. Grace's body was issuing such an amount of pus that it was also clear the bed on which her body was laying was not where she habitually slept. Failure to provide proper medical care was gross neglect. The girl would have suffered intense pain, and it was her parents' duty to call a doctor in to treat her. One doctor said he had never seen a body in such a wretched state without a doctor having been called in. Florence confessed to Sergeant Broderick that Grace was so offensive to sight and smell that she had to put her to bed a week prior to her death. Florence remarked in a piteous tone, "Don't be too hard on us. We did everything for the best." A magisterial inquiry was held into the death on the 10th of November 1903. The medical evidence and Macdonald's pathetic attempts at explaining it away causing indignation in the town. Macdonald, despite being quite wealthy, paid only for a pauper's coffin for his daughter. A man named Charles Irwin helped Macdonald carry it, slung on a stick, to the grave. At 6 o'clock on Friday morning the 13th of November, both Angus and Florence Macdonald were arrested and taken to the lock-up at Longreach. When told of the charge, Angus muttered, "What? Wilful murder? Wilful murder, oh God." He then remarked later, "I'll have to sell my place and leave the district. I don't care about the opinion of the local people. I will be tried by judge and jury." Florence gasped, "Oh God, Constable, I am innocent," when she was taken into custody. With their parents, Ruth and Alan were taken by a buggy to Longreach. There were only 2 cells each, 10 foot by 12 foot at Longreach, badly ventilated and unsuited to the outback climate. Florence occupied one cell, while Angus and other male prisoners were in the other. One night, 9 men were crowded in, while another was chained to a log outside. When formally committed for trial, neither of the Macdonalds demonstrated any emotion, as they pled not guilty. The trial was held in March 1904 at Rockhampton. Angus was 45 and Florence was 35 at the time, but it was said that both looked much older than that. Each, in a firm, clear voice, when asked to plead, replied, "Not guilty." Constable Tracy was called to tell the court the circumstances of the body being found. The girl had been laid on a bed in a small room next to the kitchen. As noted by Dr. Hewer, the sheets were clean, and Tracy added, barely creased. While at Urida, he encountered some of the goats kept there, of which there were about 19. He found the animals quiet and easy to handle. When asked about the sores on Grace's body, Macdonald did not blame the injuries from the goats at this time, but said they were caused by boils. Macdonald had tried telling Sergeant Broderick when reporting the death that Grace had syphilis, which was met with scepticism. Macdonald's deposition from the magisterial inquiry was read in the trial, where he attempted to paint his deceased daughter as an incorrigible delinquent. He claimed that while living with the Macaulay family and resident at the boarding school, she had stolen money. While going to school at Brisbane, she was lazy and slow at learning, he said. She was brought to Longreach, he said, to improve her conduct, saying that she'd been stealing and lying while living with Mrs. Collins. At Urida, he said she was not a good worker, being lazy and untruthful, lying about anything and everything. One time he complained she had been given milk to give to the dogs, but drank it herself. She had stolen tins of food from the store, sardines, salmon, and jam. He said Grace usually got up at sunrise, and denied she was made to rise at 3 a.m. on laundry days. Grace ate with the rest of the family, but about 2 months before her death she acquired a habit of dawdling, for no reason, and came to the table so late that everyone else had finished their meals. He knew she had sores on her body for 6 or 7 weeks, but claimed that Florence was treating them, and that during the last 2 months of her life she was not asked to do any work. The toil fell on the shoulders of poor Florence to do. Samuel Irwin testified that he was working at Urida carting posts and firewood when Grace arrived. He observed Grace scrubbing the veranda and kitchen and washing the children. She was not lazy, always pottering about, and got on very well with the children. She always answered quickly if addressed by her parents. Samuel said the family ate their meals on the veranda. The babies would be fed first by Florence, then Grace would take them away, and Angus and Florence would dine. He never saw Grace eating with the family. In fact, he never saw her eat anything at all. Samuel corroborated Constable Tracy's assertion that the goats were quiet. Charles Irwin was paid to dig a grave at Urida for Grace on the afternoon of the 1st of November. Then he helped Angus to bury the body. He then stayed on for about 5 weeks to look after the property. During that time he milked the goats, and he became the 3rd person to comment on their docile natures. Richard Gath of Bexley Station said that on a cold, cloudy day in late June, he had gone to Urida to inform the Macdonalds that sheep would be travelling on the stock route through their property. He saw a girl on the veranda as he rode up, but she went inside. He knocked on the door for about 5 minutes but received no answer. At that point, Macdonald rode up. While talking to him, he noticed the girl had come outside again. She was wearing what appeared to be an old brand bag for a skirt, and a man's shirt, minus the arms, for a blouse. She had bare legs and feet. Even for a bush girl, she looked underdressed and shabby to Gath. A woman from inside called the girl back in. Gath knew some of the Macaulays of Durham Ox, where Macdonald's first wife had come from. Macdonald said that a 160-acre property at Pyramid Hill had been left to Grace in her mother's will. In court it was denied that the property had been willed to Grace, and that she had instead been willed £200 when she turned 21, or when she married if sooner. Gath stuck by his version of the conversation. Walter Poole, storekeeper and mail contractor, said that he went to Ureda each Tuesday and Wednesday. One day in September, Grace said the rest of the family were out driving in a buggy when she handed him a letter. He said she had on a coarse canvas dress, but no hat or boots. He thought she was ill, being very thin and looking miserable. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, with big black rims around them. She seemed to be frightened of something. He had seen her before in the winter without stockings or boots, when he felt cold enough to wear an overcoat and have a rug around his knees. Previous to March 1903, Poole had often been invited inside the house, but after that Macdonald would usually meet him outside. Frederick Milburn had a property called Dara, about 26 miles from Ureda. He called on Macdonald on the 9th of October to report travelling sheep. As he approached the house, he heard Florence scolding Grace. "Hurry up and get to work there, or I'll come down and liven you up a bit." Florence was sitting on an easy chair on the veranda, but went inside when she noticed Milburn. Grace was standing in the sun at about 2 p.m. on a very hot day, without a hat. She was wearing a brown overall that barely reached her knees and was slit down the back to her waist. It was old and worn, with many holes in the front. In front of her was an upturned fruit case, on which she was cleaning knives with her left hand. Her right hand was resting on the box. Although it was hot, there was no shade for the girl, although there was a shed made of boughs nearby. The girl was skin and bone. Milburn had never seen a person so thin. Her skin was tanned a rich brown, so that he thought at first she was an Aboriginal girl. Her feet were big and swollen, and they and her legs were dirty, and the skin peeling off. Her eyes were sunken, and yellow matter adhered to her eyelids. Tears had made paths down the dirt on her cheeks. Even from a distance he could smell a disagreeable odour coming off of her. He spoke to Macdonald and went to leave the way he had entered, past Grace, but Macdonald guided him around the other way. He left, but returned a while later to inquire about a space to camp, with sheep nearby. The girl was still in the sun, cleaning the knives. The defence argued that there was no evidence against Florence, and that if Angus had neglected his daughter, he was guilty only of manslaughter. On the afternoon of the 3rd of March, the jury convened for an hour, returned, and said it was wilful murder, and both the monstrous Macdonalds were guilty. The pair had displayed no emotion during the trial, and when asked if they had anything to say, Angus shook his head, and Florence said simply, "No." Judge Power sentenced them both to hang by the neck until dead. An appeal was lodged, and a respite ordered in the execution. Arguments in the appeal were heard in early May by the full court. Their decision was delivered on the 10th of May. Judge Power said, "Neglect, where there was no intention that death would ensue, was manslaughter. But wilful neglect, coupled with ill treatment and absence of medical aid, would amount to wilful murder, if by these acts the jury was satisfied that it was contemplated by the prisoners that death would ensue. If the object of the prisoners was to kill the child by a slow course of torture and a slow course of neglect, it was murder." Florence had taken one of her own children to the doctor in Longreach when she was ill. There was evidence Florence had locked food away from Grace, who was starving. Grace was inadequately clad, though clothes that fitted her were present. She was made to work when movement caused her physical pain. Even though Florence had trained as a nurse, nothing was done to properly treat the sores on the girl's body. Angus had beaten the girl, and was presumably responsible for her fractured ribs. There was, in addition, the potential of financial gain from the money left to Grace in her mother's will. The full court agreed, and the conviction was affirmed. The Macdonalds would still meet the executioner. Then on the 19th of May, a shocking decision was made. The Executive Council of the Queensland State Government held a special meeting and reprieved the odious pair from the gallows. Instead, their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment with hard labour. The friends and supporters of the evil pair had given up on the hope of having a petition signed for clemency, as there was barely anybody willing to sign such a document. Instead, they used what influence they had within legislative circles. The Truth newspaper gave vent to feelings of what had inspired this act of mercy. As they put it, Truth, and every other democratic medium, knows full well that hanging and flogging are punishments reserved specially for Bill Smith the hod carrier and Jack Brown the lumper, for the man clad in moles and shod in bluchers. No one ever yet saw a criminal frock-coated and bell-toppered triced up to the triangle or stood on the drop. 'Tis not surprising, therefore, that the murderous Macdonalds have been reprieved. It was well known that the Premier, Arthur Morgan, considered that miners, pastoralists and farmers were the true wealth producers of Queensland, and that city folk were useful drones for paying taxes. The paper went on to say that if Macdonald was executed, an insurance company would have had a hefty payout to his children. They also pointed out that his uncle occupied an important legislative position. And thirdly, the Macdonalds had a powerful friend in a certain financial institution who had advocated on their behalf. Florence had become the first woman in Queensland to be given a life sentence and sent to Boggo Road Jail in Brisbane. The evil woman was so detested by her fellow prisoners that she had to be kept locked in her cell most of the day for her own protection. Her cell, F2, had a steel outer door and an inner barred door with wire mesh, allowing her to see out onto the prison gardens. The wicked stepmother was released from jail on the 10th of December 1915, having spent barely 12 years locked up for her terrible crime. She changed her name and fled into obscurity, although it is known that when she died in her 90th year, in 1957, she was buried in an unmarked grave in Toowoomba Cemetery. Angus Macdonald was sent to St Helena Jail and was due for release on the 12th of March 1916. He died in Sydney on the 5th of August 1924. Ruth Macdonald, Grace's stepsister, married Reverend George Bathurst Miller on the 9th of January 1931. She died aged 92 and was buried on the 3rd of November 1993 in Sydney. Alan, Grace's stepbrother, adopted the surname Mackenzie after his grandmother's maiden name and passed away on the 9th of February 1974. Urida Station was purchased by Tommy Pine in 1932 and renamed Fairmount.